Many of us already know Reverend Tina Simpson. But for those who don't, we have a couple of newcomers. I'll tell you a little bit about her. She is Minister Emeritus from the First Unitarian Church in Rochester, where she faithfully served for 9 years as Minister of Spiritual Development and Pastoral Care. At present, she mentors and facilitates for UU Wellspring and is in fact starting a monthly Wellspring pilot right here today. Reverend Tina also assists us with our Soul Matters small group program. We have 3 different groups, and one of them, the virtual group, is open. Reverend Tina is an interfaith minister educated and ordained through One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York City and holds a certification in spiritual counseling. She is an associate member of the UU Ministers Association. She's a wife, she's a mother, she's a grandmother, and she walks this life with her partner, Joe. The program today is Chasing Lucifer.
Well, once we have that children's story, I don't really think I need to do the sermon at all. And I'm not the only one who noticed they were red and blue, right? Okay. Our reading today is called, May Your Love Convert Lucifer. Abba Jacob said, I pray for Lucifer. I rather like him, you know. My moral theology professor once said, God hates Satan. I said, oh, I hope not. If God hates Satan, then God must hate me too, because I am a sinner, but God loves me. If the devil has anything to do with half the hate and evil that goes on in the world, as it seems he does, then he is a terrifying being. On the other hand, his power was broken by God's great gifts of love and life, and he was created good and beautiful, and God still loves him. Why then should we hate him? So I pray for him every once in a while. When I think of it, I bet it makes him mad as hell. Here ends today's reading. Have you ever had a moment in your life when a confluence of events occurred and changed the way you think about the world? Well, this happened to me a few weeks ago. You see, I was beginning to despair, like many of us. The constant agitation caused by the events of the world, the wars, the poverty, our government's inability to address the critical problems of our time, they left my head spinning, my heart breaking, and they left my soul exhausted. I was left with a burning question in my heart. What is wrong with us? Why can't we get this right? And then my best friend called to tell me about her morning. As a note, this story I'm about to tell, well, it ends well. You see, her dog took off with a herd of deer while she was playing fetch in the schoolyard. It was a cold Sunday morning, and the dog is rather young. He's 18 months. He was doing great with obedience training, and a pack of deer is just enticing, and there was this small opening just big enough for Rusty to squeeze through and take off. Now, if you're a dog owner, you know that the best thing to do when your dog takes off is to stay put and call them. That's so hard and can be really frightening, but that's what my friend did. She stayed in the schoolyard and she called, and her voice probably gave away her panic. Within minutes, a couple from the house next to the school came out to help. The husband, in his pajamas, with his own dog on a lead, simply asked, which way did he go? My friend pointed to the ravine, and he took off with his pup to find her. The wife, also in her pajamas, got into the car and yelled to my friend that she had activated the neighborhood watch about a missing dog and would drive around the neighborhood streets in case he came up out of the woods onto the street. The whole neighborhood came out. 40 minutes after Rusty tasted freedom, he came running down the road back to the schoolyard to the waiting arms of my friend. She was shaken. Later that day, she brought a batch of cookies to the couple who helped her so much that morning. And then she recounted this story to me. She said, you know, It's odd. When I got to their house, I noticed they had one of those bumper stickers on the back of the car. You know, the one with the black and white flag and the thin blue line that goes through. They helped me, she said. A lesbian with tattoos and piercings. They didn't blink an eye. They came out in their pajamas. How quickly we judge each other, and how easily we expect them to also judge us. That made me think so much about what we were getting wrong. Kurt Gray is a social psychologist in neuroscience who teaches at the University of California in Chapel Hill. He studies political polarization. In other words, he studies what happens in our minds when we think about our political opponents. Very simply, he tells us, we see each other as villains and victims. They are villains, and we are victims of their evil. Here's what happens. We make a series of assumptions and draw a series of conclusions so swiftly and automatically that we don't have time to think or feel. What triggers this? Visuals like bumper stickers, body art, piercing, the media, and the power elites, our politicians, who reinforce these stereotypes with incredible tenacity to keep our attention on the war between us rather than issues that need to be dealt with. Through his research, Dr. Gray finds that we think our side is smart, thoughtful, rational, and the other side is stupid, duped, not wanting policies that help them, and they are tricked by the media. Guess what? The other side thinks the exact same thing, that they are smart, thoughtful, rational, and we are stupid, duped, not wanting policies that help us, and that we are tricked by the media. Each side believes that they are saving democracy. The more strongly partisan an individual is, the more they hold this bias. And it is a bias because it's not founded in fact. And on top of it all, each side grossly overestimates how much the other side severely dislikes them. Overestimates by 300%. Now, Dr. Gray has done research on thousands of people across the country. So it's not a small sample size that we can say, oh, geez, it doesn't mean anything. So I wondered, how does this affect our ability to have meaningful conversations? Because if two people or groups of people disagree, like our characters in this great story, well, there's areas for discourse and ultimately compromise. However, with these strong biases, there's not even a smidgen of possibility for discussion or compromise because the other side is evil. Fascinating, isn't it? My friend assumed a person with the kind of bumper sticker would never help a person like her. And yet they did, without hesitation. And I believe this is more how we are than it is not. As I was researching this concept further, I came across a video called "What's It Like to Be You?" Made me think of my friend Marge. It's a video by Charles Eisenstein, and it's on YouTube on a channel called Sustainable Human. I suggest you find it and watch it. I suspect you too will find new insights in his simple yet revolutionary wisdom. I actually thought about showing it here as part of my sermon, but frankly, there's a bit of language that isn't sanctuary safe. I'll do my best to share his words and ideas without the expletives. Eisenstein begins by telling us the truth about ourselves, and he agrees with Dr. Gray that we demonize each other. We see the other as the devil. We disagree on issues, social issues, political issues, cultural issues, and yet we agree on one thing. The other side, well, there's something wrong with them. they have a moral deficiency. You see, that's why they disagree with us, the moral people, the good people. Both sides agree wholeheartedly with this statement, and they also agree with the tactics we should use to combat each other. And I'd like you to notice the word I'm using here. I said combat each other, because the tactics we use are blaming and yelling and name-calling and vilifying the other. They are the tactics of war. We find the enemy and we make every effort to defeat them. Eisenstein continues to explain that most of our social problems are deeply complicated and extremely difficult to solve, like climate change, immigration, women's rights, racism. So what do? We name the closest enemy, most often the victim of the problem, and then we attempt to solve the problem with tactics of domination. Consider for a moment our history as a country. We've seen a war on poverty, a war on drugs. Yet rather than solve the complex problems, the tactics of war, domination have effectively shut out and even imprisoned the victims of these problems. The most current and strongest example is that of immigration, where the southern border is devastated with an onslaught of those seeking asylum, and those seeking asylum are criminalized. We don't know how to be without an enemy. We take every problem and turn it into a war. We are doing it as we navigate the current treacherous cultural upheaval and political polarization. But Eisenstein and Gray point out that when we stop blaming the apparent culprit, we can enter a deeper place of moral humility, a place of not knowing, a place in which we may be uncomfortable and unfamiliar, but a place that makes us open to a deeper understanding of complicated issues. And friends, moral humility is hard, but it offers that possibility of transformation. It's a place where together, as a diverse society, we can work out real solutions to real problems. Our war-making habits don't work. Making others into the devil does not banish evil. It perpetuates a world society of profound separation that doesn't look deep enough into the problems that are pressing our world to solve them. So how do we change this entrenched reliance on combating evil in the other side? We do this by working to understand our flaws and asking quite simply, what's it like to be you? Only this will bring out the truth. Only this will open us to transformation. Have you ever held up a prism in the light and shifted it just a bit and brought color into a room? That's how I felt watching this video. It was a different way to see the world, a way that made infinite sense to me, and actually pointed to a possible evolutionary step for our communities, our country, and our humankind. But then the inevitable big question hits me, right? How do we do this? How do we shift this tide? How do we go against the prevailing culture? Is there any ancient wisdom or well-worn path we can follow? Are we forgetting something? Now, usually when I get to this point in my own spiritual wrestling match, I look for grounding in our Unitarian Universalist faith. We know we have principles. They are our principles that guide us in our lives. And we often look to the first principle to support the worth and dignity of all beings. And that's easy to think about. But this time, I found my grounding in a different principle, the fifth principle. I'm not going to ask you if you know what it is, but here it is. We covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregation and our society at large. Okay, our UU principles stand for our guide for right living, and I think when we read them or hear them, we often say, yeah, I can agree with that, sure. I can get behind the right of conscience. democratic process, no problem. But what I want to do is step back a moment and think with me and find a much deeper understanding of these simple words. I think here we may find some profound answers on how to bridge our differences and create a world transformed. First, let's talk about the right of conscience. What does that even mean? The right of conscience comes to us actually from the Puritans, who are the denominational ancestors of our faith. And though we've left behind most of their doctrine, we have kept this. It is our right as individuals to follow our own conscience and direct our own lives in accordance with that conscience. I think the important key here, though, is that our conscience is not constant or stagnant. It cannot be presented neatly in a news headline or a meme on Facebook or a reel on Instagram. I believe our conscience is dynamic and requires constant tending. And we do that by talking to one another and taking in information that we didn't have before. Our conscience needs attention. We must open to this deeper understanding of issues. We must see many sides of an issue and then wrestle with the meaning in our life. This takes time and effort, but frankly, friends, what do we do now? Our war making takes time and effort and accomplishes nothing. So my simple question to each of us is, how is your conscience today? Does it need examination, debate, adjusting, depth, passion? Does it need to wake up? Now, the second part of the fifth principle may also seem easy. We covenant to affirm and promote the use of the democratic process in our congregations. And here again, I contend it's not that simple. And I think we're missing some of the essential parts, at least I know I am. In 2017, the Fetzner Institute, which is kind of a spiritual think tank, began what's called the Democracy Project. The Institute had supported efforts to bridge differences and create a society based on love and connection for decades. The project was developed in the face of the growing divide in our country during the Trump presidency. Here's how they described the Democracy Project. And I love these words. We, the people, have the power to shape our democracy. Working together, we can transcend the labels that polarize us and develop a fuller understanding of what unites us. We can cultivate sacred connections with our neighbors and build a sacred vision for our communities. An inclusive America begins with each of us as individuals. We have the responsibility to practice spiritual and moral virtues that enable us all to flourish as members of a democratic society. Lots of words, so meaningful. Perhaps democracy isn't a form of government, but a personal responsibility and practice, a spiritual practice that requires more from us than staying informed and showing up on election day to vote. Perhaps it requires more from us than protesting and writing letters and signing petitions, all good things. But perhaps it is the way we behave with one another all the time. Americans are not a divided people when it comes to the kind of democracy they envision. The vast majority of us are seeking change that promotes the right of the individual over the corporation. We seek a government that works for the well-being of our communities rather than promoting a lifestyle for the super rich. Now, we know there are profound differences in how we view our society, but there is indeed common ground. It is a place to start, a place that we share and can build upon to transform fear into action and despair into possibility. Building an honest democratic process that elevates the individual and the common good is essential to solving the deep problems of the world today. Above all, this kind of democracy is in our hands, no one else's. So our action is required. But what virtues are required for this spiritual practice of democracy, and how does it show up in our lives? According to the Democracy Project, this includes love in the face of hatred and division, humility to admit we might not have all the answers, openness to having our minds changed by those with whom we disagree, and the courage to compromise. Very different than combat. Friends, there are a few others on the list. I chose the ones that I thought you would find the most challenging. Humility, compromise, and being wrong, well, that's not our strong suit. These will take work. And I think it'll require one more critical practice, and that is civility. Civility is a rare commodity these days. In fact, consideration seems downright superfluous in some circles. I believe that practicing civility may be the core of practicing democracy. Civility calls us to protect each other's dignity through thoughtful actions and compassionate speech. It is not an irrelevant nicety. Sincere civility can hold together families, our church, our communities, and perhaps even all of humanity, and it starts with each of us. But it will not come from naming the demon and ranting. It will not come from gripping our opinions with stubborn insistence. It will not come from quoting endless facts to refute the position of the other because Dr. Gray has proven to us that this just doesn't work. It will come from humbly standing down and opening our hearts and our minds to the other who is different. It will come from finding our shared values and offering civil conversations to reach compromises that respect our differences and afford the other individual their dignity. It will come from asking the question, what's it like to be you? And then listening, not to agree, not to debate, but to understand. In the words of Theodore Parker, a noted Unitarian theologian and social activist, democracy does not mean I am as good as you are. It means you are as good as I am. This is moral humility. This is transformation. May it be so, and amen.